Good to be here with all of you. So I'm Amanda Alexander. I am the founder and executive director of the Detroit Justice Center and a senior research scholar at Michigan Law School, and a member of the Carceral State Project initiative here at U of M, along with my colleagues, Ruby Tapia, Heather Ann Thompson, Ashley Lucas, Nora Krasinski, Matt Lassiter, Melissa Birch. I think that's all of us. And so it's really been our honor over the past year to host 6 of these events. And I know that many of you have probably attended at least a few of them, and so have been part of the conversations that we've been trying to really start here on the campus around what is the carceral state. That's where we started last fall. Then we got into questions of the relationship between the carceral state and criminalization. So the ways that the carceral state shows up in ways that might be unexpected, things that are criminalized that wouldn't intuitively be criminal acts. The ways that the carceral state interacts and shows up in community spaces. So outside of jails and prisons and incarceration, what are the other sites where we see carcerality and criminalization? And tonight we are going to be very forward-looking and think about beyond the carceral state. So what is it going to take in order to really move us out of the status quo that we've been in for the past several decades, and in some analyses even longer than that, to really move us to a new place? And so this evening we are joined by some really incredible panelists, and they embody what has been the spirit of the symposium all year. So we were really intentional. We did not want a lot of faculty, any faculty, on these panels. We really wanted it to be about the voices of people who have directly experienced the carceral state, so people who are formerly incarcerated or who have faced court involvement, people who are attorneys, lawyers, social workers, people with loved ones who have been incarcerated, and those were the voices that we wanted to hear from on these issues. And so before we get into that, I'll have them do 2-minute intros as we get going. And then we will have rounds of 3 different questions that I'll pose to them. And then we'll open it up to you all for audience questions and for conversation. And there should be plenty of time for that towards the end. And just a bit more in terms of framing the conversation. So this idea of getting beyond the carceral state, that is what we're doing day in, day out at the Justice Center up the road in Detroit. And so I really founded that with the idea of trying to figure out, what does abolition look like as practice? And that is a phrase that I borrow from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a geographer and who thinks very deeply about mass incarceration. And she, along with people like Angela Davis, Beth Ritchie, so many other predominantly Black women scholars who've been thinking about abolition for a very long time, say that we can't just think about abolition or ending mass incarceration as an absence. It's not just about tearing down jails and prisons, but we also have to think about the range of things that we need to build up. So after we are done and beyond this age of mass incarceration, people will probably continue to harm each other. There will still be things that we need to deal with, but we're going to need to build up a lot of other ways to address those things. And so those are the types of things that I think we'll start to talk about this evening. So with that, I will go ahead and each panelist will introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get into the conversation. So go for it, Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Steinberg. I am the legal director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan, and I've been in this position for 22 years. This is my last year, sadly. I'm moving on to teach full-time at the University of Michigan Law School, where I will be starting a civil rights clinic, and I'm very excited about that. But I've worked on dozens of cases dealing with mass incarceration and the criminal injustice system throughout those 22 years, and before that, actually.
Hi, everybody. Smooth. My name is Korbin Felder. I am a program associate with the American Friends Service Committee, Michigan Criminal Justice Program, a really long and annoying name. Most people in the state of Michigan just know us as AFSC. We do prisoner advocacy work with people in all 30 some odd Michigan state prisons. They reach out to us about a variety of issues that they're having, mainly parole, healthcare, mental health care, segregation, security, custody level, a wide range of issues that pertain to the prison landscape. Prior to that, I worked in Alabama for almost 3 years at the Equal Justice Initiative as a Justice Fellow, where I worked on class action lawsuit, Duke v. Dunn, against the ADOC for the horrendous conditions in their prisons. The DOJ just did a great report on ADOC prisons. You should check it out. It's scathing. And worked a lot with clients coming home from prison. EJI did the Miller v. Alabama case, so it was a lot of juvenile lifers and things like that. Yeah, so I'm kind of a professional advocate, and I graduated from here in 2014. It's always weird coming back.
My name is Antonio Espree. I am a former juvenile lifer. I spent over 29 years inside of the Michigan Department of Corrections. I was released in 2017 under the Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana ruling. I am a resident in the state of Arizona, Phoenix, where I attend Arizona State University. I major in justice studies in the School of Social Transformation. I do a lot of panel discussions and lecturing around the issues of mass incarceration, school-to-prison pipeline, and other social injustice issues. And I'm connected to Arizona Justice Project, which is sort of like the Innocence Project. They help to exonerate men and women off death row in Arizona. And I also work with lobbyists out in Arizona who fight to have legislators change their position around sentencing young people. And I also strategize with different attorneys and families in terms of working with those who are incarcerated. And I mentor two women currently who has been affected by the punishment system.
Hi, my name is Hazelette Crosby-Robinson. Ooh, that's loud. MSW. I graduated from the University of Michigan School of Social Work, Ann Arbor campus. Ooh, blue. I'm a formerly incarcerated individual at Huron Valley Women's Facility. And after post-incarceration, I went back as a volunteer in Scott Regional Correctional Facility on Beck Road in Plymouth for 15 years as a volunteer to talk with women about having different choices. At that point, I decided that it would behoove me to go back and finish my graduate degree so I could work with women on the outside and formerly incarcerated individuals and individuals with substance use disorders to prevent them so much recidivism. It made more sense to be there than to watch people come back and forth and back and forth. While I was there, I took one of my first college courses because the state of Michigan had been sued by my dear friend, Mary Heinen, who was sitting here on the front row. And I was able to take advantage of one of those courses, and that sort of renewed my drive to go back to school and complete my graduate degree. And so thank you for everything that you've done. And so after that time, rebuilding. So I was the co-chair of the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative. When it started, I just saw Joe Summers come in. I actually replaced him, when he left, which was large shoes to fill, and so I'm no longer doing that at this time. I am the president of the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency, and we advocate for raise the age, pretty successfully. We still have another step to go, and issues that relate to juvenile justice, because we believe an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if we could, get into that prison pipeline stream and somehow intervene, then that is one way of reducing mass incarceration. But there are so many different avenues and so much work for so many people to do. And so currently I'm a civil service commissioner in the township where I live. And I just my last job that, I retired from the county. I worked for 25 years with persons with mental illness and substance use disorders. And I retired from there. And then I went to work for Alternatives for Girls because, again, I wanted to be there at the, earliest stage, in earliest stages and catch this early. And then after that, I worked as the program director for Hope Against Trafficking, which are survivors of human trafficking. So currently, I think I'm retired.
Hello. I'm Paige, or PG. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I'm a organizer, I'm a facilitator, I'm a strategist. I'm a prison industrial complex abolitionist. I'm a direct action practitioner and trainer. And the main things I spend my time doing are making and holding space for Black people, particularly young Black people, particularly queer Black people, to have the time and the space to imagine new worlds for ourselves, because we spend so much of our time not believing that other things are possible. And so I find that to be a lot of the ways I spend my time. And the other time is thinking a lot about how people, systems, and processes work together. So I just completed my degree in organizational development, and I support organizations with like strategic planning and things like that. And I think why I was invited to talk tonight is because I'm a part of the No New Jails Detroit Coalition, which is right now trying to stop the development of a $533 million county jail complex being built in the city of Detroit. And we've been working since last year to just really change the narrative around why this jail is necessary, why people think any jail is necessary, and to make more noise about this issue, because the county is determined to move very quickly and very quietly. And they think that if they can do that, then they'll be able to build this complex with little resistance. And we plan to put up as much resistance as possible to it, and hopefully stop it before it is supposed to be built in 2020. I just said I finished my master's at University of Detroit Mercy. I didn't go to U of M for any of my degrees. I went to Wayne State and U of D Mercy, and I was in the community development program there. And so for my capstone, we did a project about restoratively just community development and what community development could look like without jails. And a lot of that was inspired by the Detroit Justice Center's work and the work of Designing Justice, Designing Spaces based in Oakland, Deanna Van Buren. Her work around building restorative justice centers and replacing jails with these like holistic care spaces and community spaces for people. So excited, I'm always excited to talk about what's beyond all of this, because I believe there's something beyond it in our lifetime. And I think we just got to talk about it more and get all on at least a similar page. We're not all going to be on the same page about everything all the time, but it's like, how can we as communities get more and more clear about what is possible, so then we can start actively practicing it and working towards it.
Thank you. I told y'all, it's a rock star panel. These are just the people I want to have this conversation with. So for this first question, some of the purported goals of criminalization and incarceration are to punish those who've committed crimes, to promote public safety, and to reduce crime. But over the past year, this symposium has drawn on the wisdom of community activists, lawyers, formerly incarcerated people, social workers, and other practitioners to reach a far more nuanced idea of what the carceral state is and what it does. So the question is, what does true community safety and well-being mean to you? And how does that relate or not to the current version of the carceral state? Anyone, jump in.
Okay, I'm doing it. All right. To me, when I think about the times I felt most safe, or what could make me feel safer when I don't feel safe, is really a lot about like knowing who's around me, feeling a sense of collectivity and community. Something that I talk about is like, I can feel safe when I know all my basic needs are met and the people around me have their needs met, so they're not coming to me looking for any of their needs to be met. Everything's taken care of. There's no reason to, ideally, right? There's no reason to cause harm or violence to each other, because everything that we need is there for us. And then I also just think that a lot of times, so right now, actually in Detroit, we're working against this surveillance program, Project Greenlight, And a lot of the pushback that we're getting from our people, from the people that we want to be building with, is that this does make them feel safer. You know, like having this 24/7 feed that goes directly to the police makes them feel comfortable in places where they would not have been comfortable otherwise. And I think that's valid. I think there is something about knowing that somebody has their eyes on you, but like for me, it's not the state having their eyes on me, right? It's like us having our eyes on each other and looking out for each other and knowing that if something were to happen, we would step up and protect each other. So how is it related to the carceral state? It's not in my ideal sense, in my ideal world and in the world that I try to practice and be in community with every day, it's disconnected from that carceral state completely. And I think it's gonna take some time to get from a place where like, yeah, my most immediate community, I can feel that. And then when I go out somewhere else, I don't necessarily, right? It's gonna take some time for that to be able to reverberate in larger places. But I do think it starts with us focusing really hyper-local, like on our blocks, in our neighborhoods. How can we make sure that we like are good with each other? And then that kind of echoing out to the rest of the world.
Thank you.
I think that in response to that question, it takes a significant amount of reinvestment back into the community and what that looks like. What does it look like for resources that left certain communities to return without the agenda of biases or discriminations that prevent certain folks from working or achieving or attaining certain possibilities within that space? I think it takes for community, the true community to feel safe, for banks to stop redlining, for gentrification to stop, and a host of other things which pulls from certain communities to create the conditions for those communities to collapse. So a true community has to, for me, it has to look like those institutions and structures reshaping and reforming the way in which they perceive ethnicities overall. Not just one in particular in favor to support, but all ethnicities as one up under the same umbrella with equal access, equal opportunity to succeed and be successful. So communities that are targeted and that are subjected to incarceration, apprehension, arrest, and ethnicities that are profiled behind it are the same communities that suffer from having those strong institutions and access to those resources. So being able to change how that looks is what I look at first, in opposed to looking at, let's change the people. Because we can change the people, but if we don't have what's necessary and what's needed in the suburban area and low-income communities, if we can eradicate low-income communities overall, a difference can be made. So, you know, how does it relate to the carceral state? It relates as we have these conversations to push, you know, towards this, for people to leave from these conversations and push within their own individual communities or who they know are connected to change their idea about reinvesting into communities that are suffering the most. One thing that I say in terms of that, you know, in my conversations, I tell people not to look at the state. Don't look at the state to help you if the state has invested $1 billion inside of the Department of Corrections. So if the Department of Corrections has $1 billion operational expense, why doesn't the city of Flint, right? Or Hamtramck, you know? So if you're not, if the state has invested in the punishment system, and if the state has indebted itself into the punishment system, then the state is not the answer. You know, the room should be filled with young people. The young people are the answer to moving the old ideologies away from what's been in place and perpetuated, which continues the creation of this monster in which we face in our society, which has become normal. I can go on and on.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
You know, I just came back yesterday from some time in Africa. And as I'm thinking about these questions and the overrepresentation of African American, especially males in the system, it makes me look at the family structure. The family structure and the things in both Paige and Antonio have said things that make me think about things that have affected the family structure, and really taken, been an assault on the structure of the family. Because in order for communities to be strong, it has to be families that are strong. And if the resources that families need to be strong aren't there, then what do? If you have a group of people that are looking for you to feed them and you're the head of the family and you don't have the resources, the education, the job, or anything to feed them, then you're looking 2 blocks down and somebody is making a whole bunch of money and able to feed their family, then that would tend to lead to crime. And it just breaks down the whole family structure, which is the structure of the community. That is the basis. And I know when I was, and I think that is, okay, I'm going to just go on out there because I'm out there anyway. And I looked at the family structures in Africa. They really talk about, when they say family structure, they mean that. It is built in them. And it is very interesting to me. I also went to Gore Island. It's very striking that the first thing that happened to African Americans when they got here is that the family structure was disintegrated. Parents were separated from children. Everybody was sent a different way so they wouldn't have an identity, a culture, and not even know their name. So I think that is, and so now we're looking at a society that is overrepresented by African American men and people of color in a system that I think goes all the way back to the disintegration of the family. And without the resources that Antonio is saying are needed in the community for the families, and what Paige is saying, then I don't believe that we can ever tackle this problem. So we're always looking at the end where people are in the system, and now we want to end mass incarceration by getting them out, which is good. But we need to pay some more attention to the family structures and making sure that communities have the resources that they need so they're not going in the first place. It really bothers me that somebody can look at a second grader and say that because their reading level is a certain level, they're going to end up in prison. Why aren't we putting more resources into getting their reading level if that is really a true indicator? Then why aren't we looking at that whole family structure and getting the resources these children need so they're not in the pipeline in the first place? I'm just saying.
I can't really. Hello? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So yeah, I actually like what everyone said so far. I'm going to try not to echo that. I'm going to call you PG because you're going to be like our point guard tonight. You're going to bring the ball forward. That's like an early dad joke. So yeah, like Hazelette was saying, I think for me it's more so about being proactive instead of reactive. I think with all the conversation that's happened over the course of the semester, am I kind of going in and out or?
You're good.
Okay, good. I don't want to have to get my face too close to this. But nonetheless, being proactive instead of reactive, right? Because the criminal legal system, I know that the conversations in previous panels talked about the criminal legal system, and we know that's reactive, right? Like the history of this state, for instance, in 1992, there was a crazy dude named Leslie Allen Williams who got out of prison on parole, raped and murdered 2 women, and I think he kidnapped one as well. And the entire parole board was fired, right? And every state has a story like that. And nationally, right, we talk about the Willie Horton thing, and that the criminal legal system will just react, and just the belief that bad things are inherently going to happen. And I don't think that's actually true, just off of basic human history, right? Like, if you just read the spark notes of Discipline and Punishment, Foucault talks about how prisons are a new creation. Humans have lived for the majority of our existence on this world without prisons. And prisons actually were a reform, right? Let's stop cutting off people's hands and executing them publicly. And, so also AFSC is a Quaker organization. Fun fact, Quakers played a major role in the creation of the first prisons. The idea of solitude, all prisons were solitary confinement. You sat in the dark all day, every day, and you thought about what you did wrong. We now know that's torture. But that was a reform, right? Like, because I guess that's better than cutting off people's heads in public, but to each their own. So nonetheless, being proactive versus reactive, how do I articulate this? I had a big loss personally recently. I'm a big fan of Nipsey Hussle. Rest in peace, the marathon continues. In that situation, more than anything, I've really hated a lot of the conversations that come out of his death about, oh, well, if you're a successful black person, you shouldn't return to the hood. No, that's actually totally antithetical to everything that NIP stood for. But I say that to say that that situation made me think about the inability for certain people to address interpersonal conflict. And we don't actually really try to teach people how to do that. I understand that the public school system in this country has a lot of problems, to say the least. Shout out to my girl, Betsy. So, nonetheless, I like to make kind of inappropriate comments if you can. But, oh yeah. You're our shooter tonight, Hazelette. But yeah, so nonetheless, we don't teach interpersonal conflict in schools, right? And that's what I'm talking about being reactive, right? It's just like we talk about the school prison pipeline. It's like, oh, so after a kid messes up, let's lock them up or whatever, right? Instead of like, let's actually like try to teach these kids when you have an argument, let's not fight. In the case of NIP, there was a verbal altercation. The guy came back hours later. Whatever was said doesn't warrant someone getting shot in the head. But that's the reality, right? That young man didn't know how to solve his conflict without violence, and thought that violence was warranted in that situation. And we actually need to teach young people how to address conflict. And it's not, sometimes the restorative justice conversation annoys me because it's just like, oh, so after some terrible shit happens, let's talk about these restorative justice circles. And the conversation should be, and everything that Hazelette was saying, right? Like, what do we need to do to make sure bad stuff doesn't happen? Because I don't think bad stuff is inherently going to happen, because for most of human history, we lived without prisons and police, and we got to this point, I guess. So yeah, and I really liked what you said, PG, about the idea about green light, because I live in Detroit. I stay on the west side. My mom's old neighborhood. I bought a house, Russell Woods, Livernois, Davison area. You stay over there?
I stay a 7 mile out of drive. So
okay, yeah, for sure, yeah. So nonetheless, I had a kind of similar experience, right? Like, and let's be honest, right? I went to U of M. I took these similar classes that some of you undergrads are taking, right? Yes, we have to talk about race. We have to talk about white supremacy. But just because someone's black or just because someone was formerly incarcerated actually doesn't mean that they're going to support like abolition per se. Just in the same way that poor white people often vote against their own economic interests, right? Like, my personal story was that I live right across from Russell Woods Park, which is a really nice park on the west side of the city. And I move in shortly, I'm outside doing some work or whatever, a neighbor flags me over, an older black gentleman walking his dog. I start talking to him. He asked me what I do for a living. I say I do criminal justice reform work. He says, good, we need to lock some of these mofos up. They're breaking into houses. And it's like, that's not really what I do. You heard criminal justice, you stop listening, but okay, for sure. And then he told me that he wanted me to meet his daughter because he was sick of the knucklehead she was messing with. And I was like, okay, yeah, no, I'm gonna go back. But nonetheless, right, and I think you all had Ron Simpson Bay on one of these panels, right? Yeah. I absolutely love Ron because Ron will be the first person to tell you, I did 27 years in MDOC, I don't want to see some of those dudes out, right? Because that's actually the conversation we have to have when we talk about abolition. Like, what do we do with the people who've turned into the monsters that the state wanted them to become, right? Me working in a place like Alabama in arguably the worst DOC in the country, in the Western Hemisphere, arguably. And I don't want to play Oppression Olympics, but when you're talking about prisons that have 17% of the officers that they need and people are being kidnapped, like, some of those people are not ready to come home. And the question is, what do we do with that, right? And I think it's really easy when you live in a place like West Bloomfield or where I grew up in northern New Jersey, South Orange, shout out South Orange. But people who've been that seriously damaged aren't coming back to those places. So we keep on reporting that. But there's a reason why that dude across the street from me was like, yeah, our community is being victimized by crime, and I don't want to have my house broken into, which is a fair statement. But the solution can't be the state, right? And the solution can't be sending more young black people to prison. I think I went over my 4 minutes. I apologize, Big Mike. I'm gonna call you Big Mike. You're our 5. She's the point guard. And, yeah.
I'm shooting the free throws to win the game.
Yeah.
This question about what is true well-being and true safety raises existential questions, and I thank you for letting me think about this. But a lot of the things I'm going to say echoes what the rest of the panel has said, but I think we have to look at the root causes of crime and think about what a truly safe and society that meets the well-being needs of everybody looks like. And I think it's a society where there's not the economic disparities that exist today. It's a society where there's a social welfare net, so people have enough food, people have shelter, people have health care, people have access to quality education, where people have access to help getting over their drug problems and mental health problems. I think we need to live in a society, if everybody's going to truly be safe and well, that is not built on racism or sexism or discrimination against immigrants or LGBT persons or religious or ethnic minorities. I think we need a society where we're going to solve our problems not through violence and militarism, but through words. And we live in a militaristic society where violence is celebrated. I agree with all the comments about Project Greenlight, and I think we need to live in a society where we celebrate civil liberties and we don't give the government the power to monitor us 24 hours a day wherever we go. To the extent that we need to take some people out of regular society, if we want to truly be safe, we have to rehabilitate these individuals and not lock them up in cages and punish them so they're worse when they come out and more dangerous. We have to provide them with training so they can get a job when they get out, education, deal with the mental health issues and the drug problems. If we treat them like animals, that's what we're going to get when they come back out, and that's not going to make us more safe. None of these things that I just talked about are related in any way to the carceral state. The prison industrial complex is built on racism, economic disparity, punishing people, punishing the poor, punishing the mentally ill, punishing those who would abuse drugs. And we have to break that and change, think about the root causes of where we are now if we want to get to where we want to be.
Thank you. So as each of you were talking, I was thinking back, Antonio, you had said wanting to ask young people what they would want, and so I was thinking back last fall, we did that at the Detroit Justice Center. So last summer, we sued Wayne County in federal court because they had denied the public the right to be heard about whether or not we should build a new jail. But then last fall, we convened 13 to 18-year-old youth organizers in Detroit. And we asked them, how would you spend $500 million in your community in order to feel safe and empowered and valued? And you wouldn't be surprised, not one of them said more jails or more police. But they had these brilliant ideas, and a lot of them sound a lot like what you've said. So the top idea was one girl suggested we need a mental health spa. So this is a place where you can go where there would be individual therapy and group therapy, a place where you could just go to talk through whatever is bringing you anxiety, whatever's on your heart and on your mind. And they had designed it down to what would be the most soothing paint colors on the walls for folks. They said, there was a boy who said, if I had all that money, I would give it away to my neighbors because I would know that if they were safe and good, that my family and I would be okay. There was one girl who said, I wish there were a building where you could go where if you needed money, like you really, really needed money, then you could get it without filling out a lot of paperwork. So, kind of this actual social welfare, safety net that isn't actually a bureaucracy that keeps people shut out. So they had a long list of ideas: community mental health centers, affordable housing. They said pay our teachers, fix the lead pipes in our schools. They had all these ideas, and it was important to me to ask young people, because whatever gets built in the next 4 years, it's not just my grandkids that will live with it; it's their grandkids. They're going to inherit this. And also, young people use public space more than adults do. They are in public schools 8 hours a day. They walk down the sidewalk. They take the bus. They can't get into bars, so they go and hang out in public parks. And so I think they should have an outsized voice when it comes to public spending around safety. So I just wanted to lift up some of those young people's voices, because it sounds a lot like all the things that you've been saying. But so to get into our second question for the panel, what are the strategies that will help us get beyond the carceral state? What strategies are you and your organization using to combat prisons and jails and to build towards new approaches to safety and justice? And what work in Michigan or elsewhere gives you the greatest sense of hope? There's really like 3 questions in there, but take whatever you want.
Does the point guard go first?
The 4 will.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay, so the strategies that help us, I'm just reading off mine because I forgot what Amanda said already. I'm just not a good listener. There's nothing wrong with you. But yeah, so at AFSC, I think we believe that this work really is kind of about personal transformation, and we try to do a lot of personal transformation work in the prison landscape. So AFSC, shameless plug, on that back table there's some flyers for the Good Neighbor Project that my fantastic coworker Demetrius Titus runs. It links people in the free world to folks who are doing life or long indeterminate sentences. In LID in Michigan, we have indeterminate sentencing, right? Like a 30 or 50 year. So someone who has a long time to go before they're parole eligible is what an LID is, like a better phrase, depending on where you're from. Some people call it basketball scores. Where I grew up in Jersey, we called it football numbers. Like you're not supposed to be 77, but on a lineman's jersey, right? Nonetheless, the work that the Good Neighbor Project does is also, it's to get the person in prison to actually reflect on the harm that they may have done, but not in like the shaming way that the state often does it, but it's like, there's some people who are lifers, been down 30-something years, and they've never actually talked about the crime that they committed that led them there. And it's kind of fascinating seeing someone with life without parole who knows they're going to die in prison say, like, I finally feel free now that I've been able to talk about like what led me here. So I'm not the most touchy-feely person, but that's even powerful for me. And the Good Neighbor Project has this curriculum of getting people talking about it, and then of course the person on the outside is also learning about the realities of the carceral state, mass incarceration, prison industrial complex, whatever the hell you want to call it. That is that narrative change work that needs to happen, right? At the end of the day, it's going to be society's attitude about the issues that forces the decision makers to change, right? They're not, power concedes nothing without demand, right? There's a Good Neighbor Project. There's also the Personal Enrichment Parole Readiness. That's a curriculum that was started with a group of men at Kinross Prison a few years back ago. That's those guys running their own program that we just kind of support through facilitation materials and things like that. As similar to Good Neighbor Project, getting guys talking about it, but also has a really kind of pragmatic parole component to get people ready for the parole system and how to successfully navigate that. And for us at AFSC, we think that really strong change work is what's going to make a difference, because it's going to lead people towards freedom and ultimately keep people out of prison. And just personally, so the last part of the question, will work in Michigan or else? Like I said, I'll say this, Alabama kind of ruined me, made me even more of a pessimist than I was, but being in Michigan for close to 2.5 years now and doing work in the criminal legal system, like the fact that you all show up here, I'm on the prison and corrections section of the State Bar Association, one of the rare sections in the bar that allows non-attorney members. It was actually started in the early 2000s through the help of people like AFSC, people like Monica Janner, other formerly incarcerated activists here in the state, you don't see people who are willing to take time, drive from across the state to the state capitol in lots of places. I've worked in the Mississippi Delta before. I worked in Black Belt, Alabama. You don't see people showing up after hours like you all did today. You don't see people showing up, on weekends for like the PNC example. And Michigan has made progress. I can talk all day about the problems with MDOC for sure. As a $2 billion budget, we spend more on corrections than higher education annually, right? There's a lot of issues. It's a huge bureaucracy. But we have made progress. I think it would be irresponsible for us to not talk about the progress that we've made in this state. Where in 2007 there was 51,500 people. There's now 38,500 people. That's still way too many people, of course. And the problem now is that we're at a point where 85% of the prison population in Michigan is not parole eligible right now. That means that there's a lot of lifers, and there's a lot of people with long LIDs, right? And that's going to be about sentencing reform. That's going to be about changing the penal code. And that starts with narrative and attitude change about people in prison, the idea of like, how long does someone actually need to serve in prison? Because everyone knows you actually don't really need to serve that long in prison to say, okay, I messed up, I'm not going to do it again. I actually am encouraged by what I've seen in my time being here in Michigan, because you don't see it everywhere in the country, particularly places that are under-resourced.
Historically, the ACLU has focused primarily on litigation to deal with a lot of these issues, and we're changing a little now. But I'm going to talk about 5 lawsuits that we've brought that I think have made a difference on mass incarceration. The first is a series of cases dealing with pay or stay sentencing, which really promotes the new debtor's prison. A pay or stay sentence is, say you plead guilty or convicted of a misdemeanor. The judge says, okay, well, you can either spend 30 days in jail or you can pay $300. And people who have money write a check and go home. People that don't have money end up staying in jail, losing their apartments, losing their jobs, losing their kids. And we brought a series of cases. We sued the judge, got a lot of attention, and eventually got a court rule that has theoretically done away with pay or stay sentencing in Michigan. There's still a little problem, but it's made a huge difference. Juvenile life without parole. I know there's people in this room who benefited from the cases that we brought here in Michigan and the case Miller versus Alabama. But that has made a huge difference in people's lives. In Michigan, we had more people sentenced to die in jail as kids for crimes they committed when they were kids than about 360, more than any other state in the country except for Mississippi. Because of these lawsuits, because the law, the mandatory life without parole has been held to be unconstitutional, people are getting out and they're doing great things. We brought a lawsuit against the state of Michigan called Duncan versus Michigan for the complete abdication by the state of its responsibility to ensure that poor people accused of crimes received constitutionally adequate counsel. We fought that case it was a class action dealing with several counties. We fought that case for 6 years, and finally we got the legislature to pass the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission, which is setting standards, requiring training, requiring adequate funding. It still has a long ways to go, but it's beginning to make a difference. We brought a case that went all the way, we won in the US Supreme Court, called Halbert versus Michigan, which required the state to provide appointed counsel to people on appeal for people convicted through guilty pleas. There's lots of sentencing issues, even for people who plead guilty. The judges exceed the sentencing guidelines. They make it consecutive instead of concurrent, and this has made a big difference in many people's lives. We've also brought many, many cases against the prisons, against jails for conditions, for cutting off access to family members, religious issues, male issues, etc. Now, recently, the ACLU has started what we call the Campaign for Smart Justice. And that's not just litigation. We're taking all parts of the organization, the legislative folks, the field folks, and the legal folks, and it's one of the major things that we're doing now. There'll be lawsuits, but they're all in conjunction with work in the field. And we've hired formerly incarcerated people to lead us on this issue. We're working in the legislature, and I can talk about this in response to the next question. There's a lot of great legislation and opportunities to cut mass incarceration. Our goals in the Smart Justice campaign are to reduce the prison population in Michigan by 50%. It was by 2020. I think we're going to extend that a little bit. And to combat racism within the criminal justice system. The three issues we're working on in Smart Justice, the first one is bail reform. When you are picked up and accused of a crime, you're supposed to be able to go home and fight your charges. The default is they set conditions and you go home and you haven't been convicted of a crime, and unless you pose a danger to society or unless you pose a flight risk, and there's no other way to prevent you from posing a flight risk or danger to society, you're supposed to be let out. That is not happening in the country, and it's certainly not happening in Michigan. And we're working on that right now. There's somebody here that spent a lot of time in a certain court doing court watching, and hopefully you'll see something very soon on that. The other two issues are sentencing reform and prosecutorial discretion. There's a series of bills in the legislature on sentencing reform. In the 2020 elections, we want people to focus more on their local prosecutors. It's something that people have not paid a lot of attention to, and the decisions and the discretion that prosecutors make and have make a huge difference in causing mass incarceration. I am hopeful. I have never been more hopeful on this issue than I am right now, and I'm kind of a pessimistic person. The reason I'm hopeful on this issue of mass incarceration is that we have reached a point where it's not a partisan issue anymore. There are people with whom we disagree vehemently about almost everything, like the Koch brothers and these very conservative libertarian Republicans. And they don't support mass incarceration either. It's not for the reasons we oppose it, for humanitarian reasons and every other good reason. It's for money. They think it's a waste of money. But the fact that we have the same goals makes me hopeful. And I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see a huge difference. Juvenile life without parole, I can't tell you how hopeful. I met a guy in February in our office named Lorenzo Harrell. He had just gotten out of prison 2 weeks prior. And he was in our office. He came up to me, and it was, I mean, there are a lot of people working on this issue. I was just one. But he was so thankful. And you know why he was in our office? It was to attend a training to learn how to lobby our legislators to stop mass incarceration. That is amazing. And there's lots of stories like that. Some of the folks are in this room. Last election, I mean, look at Florida. There's all kinds of ballot initiatives. In Florida, people voted overwhelmingly to restore the voting rights of formerly incarcerated people, people who were convicted of felonies. 1 million people who had their voting rights stripped. People are getting, it won overwhelmingly. The elimination of the death penalty in several states. It's no longer as popular as it used to be. That, to me, is very hopeful. I think that's about as much hope as I have for now.
Thank you. Other folks, strategies that your organizations are using, and also things that bring you hope.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just going to say something totally different. I'm sorry, Amanda, but I would hope somebody would look into the conditions at Huron Valley Women's Facility, which I have heard have deteriorated substantially, and that there is, they're deplorable. Okay, the state of Michigan was sued several times about that. There was a big lawsuit where women were paid out for certain abuses, but now, and I was hoping that that would be the end of that, but now it's even worse. So I'm just wondering if that has come across your radar, and if not, it just did, and if that could be something that you would look into.
Oh, it's very much on our radar.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay.
Well, the thing about strategies, I think that any part of injustice or inhumaneness that's settled for in terms of, I'll settle for partially any just that you can give me as a result of injustice that you put me under. I think that's insanity. Injustice is injustice. Inhumaneness is inhumaneness. And I go back to this, and you'll hear me be redundant about it. The answers for the state that implements the punishment to give you the answers or give you the remedy, it just won't happen unless they're willing to change, unless the ideologies in the collective attitudes about what that looks like, about what punishment looks like, and why punishment should be a part of society, unless that changes into something where it fits humanity, where it fits humaneness, where it fits justice, then we'll forever perpetuate that problem. And so how much of our society is connected to the punishment system? And how much of our taxes are taken and being put into the punishment system? And so if you, one strategy is to be able to hold whoever is responsible for taking your taxes accountable, to be able to answer to you. So they should be able to give you more answers and more solutions, or allow you in a solution or resolution process as to how to bring back rehabilitation, what rehabilitation should look like. As was said in society prior to the structure of an institution or building that is called a prison. And why is it normal in our society to want to seek punishment and vengeance as a result of whatever acts or actions that's been committed? And so while we look at the end result of things in terms of what happened as a result of, we have to look at the intentions and motives that created the conditions for the results to take place behind the actions of the individual or individuals in whatever community that happened or what that looks like. So the strategies is, I always go back to young people, is being involved. They must be involved in the people who are involved, who are doing the work, must go after young people to specifically get them to engage, to start more than just having conversations, but in their actions to be able to confront. Because if you want strategies, you want resistance. And if you want resistance, you have to have a different position, a different philosophy, a different ideology. And so that has to come with newness. And when we speak about people who have been abolitionists from the historical content, they didn't negotiate with the existing state. They didn't commend the state for halfway allowing them certain privileges or freedoms. They buckled the whole system. It had to be changed. It had to be completely dismantled, not to be rebuilt again to what it would look like. So beyond the carceral state is the imagination and bringing it to the reality of knowing that we can live in a civilized society, absent of the, as was spoken before, the control of law enforcement up under the authority of our government, who looks at society as it would be a barbaric and uncivilized society if such measures was not in place. And so we have to understand through the imagination that our society is a society as us, all of us, not in groups or classes. And in our language, we have to make those connotations that is exclusive to everybody in terms of what that looks like to helping everybody and everybody helping us and being a part. And to help us, they have to see it as they see themselves being affected by it on both ends, from the negative end and from the positive end. And so beyond it is being able to produce what it looks like to live in harmony together with one another, absent of those things that's created by systems or institutions which create the conditions for what develops or is defined by crime, and which ultimately is economically benefited and controlled by, the government. So strategies in terms of what we do individually, we need more young people to step up, and do it in a manner and in the races and in an effort as though if it does not happen today, it's not going to happen, because we can't keep having the same conversations about it 6 years from now, 5 years from now. It has to stop. And so an abolitionist makes it stop. That's true resistance. And if you want to end mass incarceration, you have to stand in the space up in that position of ending it. So, to me, that's the strategy, to produce that in the minds of our young people. Not in terms of a revolution, but not the revolution in terms that we are being defiant or being disobedient to the government or the laws, but we are holding the government accountable to who matters most. And the people are the ones who matter most in our state and to each other in our nation. So evolution in terms of what that looks like, we can't properly say that we are a successful nation or successful people if only partial of the population has evolved while others have not evolved. And so while others are suffering, while others are trying to figure out a way up out of the madness, then our evolution is cut short. Our progress is cut short. And so the strategies, I think, starts again with our young people and the collective effort of us all working together and us introducing it to each other and sharing it, as resourceful as we can.
EG, go ahead. Okay. I'm gonna hold it down for the youths. So I guess in my introduction, I didn't actually talk about the organizations I was affiliated with. But I helped to start the Detroit chapter of Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100, which is a national member-based activist organization for young Black folks between the ages of 18 and 35. And we're explicitly an abolitionist organization, and we're explicitly a Black queer feminist organization, which means that we examine the issues that we examine, we do the work that we do, we want the change that we want for the sake of the most marginalized. And again, I appreciate you saying, like, there's no oppression Olympics that we're trying to play. Like, there's no, like, oh, we're more marginalized than you, but there are folks who are marginalized within marginalized communities, right? So within Black folks, within Black communities we're all marginalized as Black people. And then you have Black queer folks, Black trans people, you have disabled Black people, you have undocumented Black people, you have neurodivergent Black people, like all these other types of Black folks that are often dismissed or erased from these larger conversations about Blackness. And you hear that when we talk about the mass incarceration and we talk about it as like a Black man issue, right? As Black men getting locked up, when there are also disproportionately a bunch of Black women and girls who are also locked up. And we know that, but it's often not a part of the larger conversation. And so I think the work that young people are doing, this particular iteration of the movement for Black lives started with Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin at our backs in 2013, right? And folks, young Black people particularly, have been out in the streets almost daily all around the country, like resisting this stuff, right? And saying that it is possible for us to put our bodies on the line for the sake of what we believe in, and that when we do that, we're making a statement that can't be ignored. And the statement that I hear folks making and that I'm a part of making with folks is that there are other ways that we need to be with each other. There are other ways that we need to understand our relationships to each other. There are other ways in which we need to hold ourselves accountable for the harm we cause and for the harm that's been caused against us and how we perpetuate that. And one, I think the tangible strategies that we've been using, particularly in BYP 100, but also across the Movement for Black Lives as like this larger body of folks who are also really connected cross organizations and interrelated. Some of those strategies are, I think the big thing is this idea of changing the conversation. It's like, how can we make so much noise that people can't ignore us? You can't have a conversation about current social movements without talking about Black Lives Matter, without talking about the movement for Black lives, because we've made so much noise that you can't ignore us, right? Like I think right now, BYP 100, we just launched, actually, we're still in our launch week of our national campaign, She Safe, We Safe, which is a national campaign to end gender-based violence against Black women, both trans and non-trans, girls, femmes, and gender non-conforming people. And we're in the midst of that. Like, the first part of this, we see as truly being in deep conversation. It really is about like getting to the bottom of like, what does make us feel safe? What do we do when huge types of violence and harm is done against us? Like, how do we come back from that? How do we not say that the person who caused it deserves isolation or eradication, but also deserves to be in some way back in right relationship with us? And so we're in a lot of deep listening. There's a webinar. There've been like Twitter town halls this week, and then there's a webinar tomorrow to talk more about the campaign, to really ideate about like what is safety for Black women, girls, trans people, gender nonconforming people. And I think part of what we have to know is that we can't get past the carceral state if we can't see past it. If all that we see in response to our conflict is, I need to call the police. Amanda and I were at I don't know what it was, a workshop, I guess, last week in Detroit to speak. And we were talking about the abolition movement and there was this like moment where we're like, what do you call the police for? Right? Like, you have to literally ask yourself, like, what is it that I call the police for? Somebody said, my neighbor is too loud. Somebody said, if your car is broken into. And these are real things for some people, right? Like, it's like, yeah, that's a big deal. I need somebody to respond rapidly to this situation that's happening right around me. But I don't think we can get past the carceral state if we can't say, like, in those situations when my neighbor's too loud, or in those situations when my car has been broken into and I can't see who did it, or like there's no way of me knowing right now who did it. Like, there is someone else for me to call. There are other people I can count on. Or there's a way I can step up and do that, I think the noise thing is a knock on the door, right? I've had the police call on me for noise before, and I've been so annoyed at my neighbors. Like, we live in an apartment building with 6 units. Knock on my door, right? Like, I can turn the music down. You didn't have to call the police. And there are just moments every day that we have to ask ourselves, like, why are we doing this? Why are we engaging? Sometimes it doesn't feel like there's another option, and that's real. Right now, there aren't a lot of other options. But if we can't start thinking that it's possible to create new options, then we're going to continue defaulting to that. And then we'll keep staying in this cycle. So I do believe that there's a group of radical, badass troublemakers, most of them young Black people, who are every day trying to like bring up other young Black folks to have these conversations, having really tough conversations around Nipsey's death, around violence in our communities, like, and having to really deal with the fact that the people we're having these hard conversations with are the same ones who probably would kill us, right? Like, let's be honest. I'm a Black, trans, non-binary person who doesn't always get read that way, you know, depending on the day. I might trick you, you know what I mean? But like, that's who I am. And there are men, Black men, who would not save me. Like, you know what I mean? They wouldn't try to help me. And I still have to be in conversation with them, right? Like, I still have to be open to transformation and like believing in their transformation, you know? No, it's okay. Thank you. It's just real. Like, you know, I was just, anyways. So yeah, that's just a reality for a lot of young Black folks. And especially as the world and our communities are becoming more and more bold, more and more proud, right? Like, people aren't staying in the closet till they're 50 years old. Like, people are coming out at 11 and 13. I used to teach at a middle school, and I had a trans student who was out and just like refused to let anybody call them by the wrong pronouns and like all that. Like, you couldn't see that 30 years ago, right? Like, that's not something that would happen. And we have to be thinking about, how do we keep them safe, right? How do we keep them safe? Wow, didn't know all this was gonna happen. But it's real, it's so personal, it's so deep. And it's about how I can be in the same room with my families and like be in that conversation and not walk away and not say that because they don't believe what I'm saying. I've been called crazy plenty of times, you know. I've been around the dinner table with my family, immediate and extended, and had these hard conversations and been like, oh, that's just Paige, you know, just whatever. But if I'm not willing to stick it out with them, if I say they're not worth it, if I get tired of the conversation and walk away, then that's another 50 years we're gonna have to deal with the same conditions, right? Like, that's another 50, 100 years we're gonna have to deal with the same shit. And I refuse to let that be our reality. So I'm just gonna go back to a strategy that gives me hope, and a strategy that I think works and that we're all responsible for individually is how we relate to each other, how we work together, how we're able to literally like be with each other. Quick other story is I was recently traveling. I'm traveling a lot lately. It's annoying, but it's fun, I guess. And so I'm in a city I don't know a lot, and I'm also broke, so I'm taking like the buses everywhere in these places I don't know. And often my phone dies. If you know me, nobody in here knows me really, but my phone's always dead. And so I'm just like out at this bus stop, and this person who's clearly like having some type of episode, right? Like, I don't know them, I don't know what's happening, but they're clearly going through something is happening right at the bus stop. And they're yelling at the other person standing by me, and they just keep coming up to their face and yelling at them and then walking away, coming up, yelling at them, walking away. So the person obviously is getting really like frightened, and just kind of like, oh my God, like trying to talk to me and joke it off or whatever. And I'm just kind of like, no, like, I don't see this as a joke. Like, I don't have right now the resources or know what to do to support this person, but I wish that was easily accessible, right? Like, I wish it was like as easy as, oh, this person is having an episode. There's a number right here on the bus bench I could call or something, right? But instead, like, this person was considering calling the police. Like, they were on the phone with their friend talking about to call the police on this person. And I like had to have a moment where, am I gonna talk to them about why they shouldn't call the police or get on this bus, you know? And I'm just like, so I had a quick thing. I'm like, you shouldn't do that. They're like having a moment, call somebody else, don't call the police. And then I got on the bus. But it was a moment where I wish I would have been able to have a deeper conversation with them, right? Like, it's those real life, in real time moments where we're able to recalibrate and say, no, actually in this moment, there's a different choice to be made. And every time we make a different choice, the state gets less and less power, but more of us have to be making those choices. Last thing I'll say is that other strategies that give me hope is that there are examples in other places around the country and around the world where they're building new systems and coming up with new ways of dealing with conflict and harm, and that these are things we can actually look to as real life models. And so some of those things are happening, like even in the Netherlands. In some of my research last year, you know, I was talking about how the Netherlands has, and I mean, there's a lot of other problems. There's been some mention of like racism, patriarchy, but not of like transphobia, homophobia, anti-blackness, like all these other things that are happening in the systems that are happening that I'm sure still happen in the Netherlands, right? I don't live there. I don't know what it's like. But they have been able to close many of their jails and prisons across the country because of the ways that they've decriminalized a lot of stuff and because of the ways that they've reprioritized mental health and healthcare. They've been able to literally close down like a dozen jails across the country. And I think that that's something to look at, right? Like, it's not the exact same context as the US, right? They don't exactly have the same history of chattel slavery or the ways that we deal with anti-immigration and all these things that our country is dealing with right now. That it's not the same context, right? So it can't be an exact replica, but there are models we can look at and there are actual things we can be thinking about in real life that don't have to always exist in the imagination. Although the imagination is fun, and we should also spend time imagining more.
Thank you so much, PG. You segued us really nicely into the last question because I think you really laid out the fact that, yes, it is about transforming systems and about keeping imaginations turned on, but it's also about the minute-to-minute interactions, the way we show up for people around us. So thank you for opening up that part of the conversation. This final question before we open it up to all of you is, what are some concrete things that people can do, folks here tonight, in order to further this work of dismantling the carceral state and building this society beyond jails, prisons, criminalization? So concrete things that folks here can do.
I can go if you want. A number of things. First of all, the ACLU is about to officially launch its Smart Justice program, and it's a grassroots strategy, and there's going to be many launch parties, and I encourage you to get involved. Melissa, right here, has been a leader in the ACLU's People Power movement, and if you go to peoplepower.org or just go to ACLU-mich.org, you can find out how to get to be part of that. There are several pieces of legislation right now in the Michigan legislature that you can contact your legislators about. I'll just mention two. One is a package about sentencing reform, and another is a series of bills that would raise the age. Michigan is one of the only states in the country, I don't know, are we the only one? One of four, where you are considered an adult and treated as an adult throughout the criminal justice system if you are 17 years old. Raise the age would make a huge deal and help people who are young and get involved in the criminal injustice system to stay out of prison. So those are two, sentencing reform and raise the age are two issues that are worth calling about. Get involved in 2020 in your local prosecutor's race, okay? Please pay attention to it, whether you live in Washtenaw County or other counties. You'd be surprised that a lot of the people representing you are not as progressive as the population. And we have to raise these issues. There's new prosecutors being elected across the country who are making a difference in mass incarceration. And lastly, I would encourage everybody to challenge your family, your friends, if they're saying things that help perpetuate mass incarceration, whether it's calling the police over something that you don't need to call the police, whether it's, joining the chorus of locking people up forever, calling people in prison animals. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to challenge that in our own lives. And I just want to say one other thing. You all give me hope. This is a huge turnout for something like this. 10 years ago, this never would have happened. I really do feel the momentum here. And we have to get involved, and things will change, at least a little bit. Yeah.
I don't want to knock you a little bit of water over. Yeah, so thank you, PG, first off. You had a great segue. And like Mike and PG said, I think for me, it's really simple. Stop calling the police. I'll give a little anecdote because that's easier said than done, right? Not calling the police. But last summer, I hosted a campaign event in my house for Abdul El Said's campaign because he pretty much let AFSC write his criminal justice platform. Although he wanted to throw some things in that just weren't factually true. There's no private prisons in Michigan. There's only 5 individuals out of 38,500 people serving time in Michigan prison for marijuana offenses. We are not Alabama. You know, and this is the other thing that really bugs me. Prison is not jail, first off. We need to stop calling them prison and jail interchangeably. Parole and probation are different.
Yes.
This is it's not a dad joke.
Could you explain what the difference is
Oh,
between jail and prison, probation, parole?
Oh, yeah. The dad joke part was that the analogy I'm trying to make popular is if I'm trying to go to the NBA, I shouldn't spend all day at a batting cage. Thank you. I know I'm funny, damn it. But nonetheless, so, right, and I said to say, right, like, we can talk about prisons, we can try to chant down Babylon all we want, but if you're chanting down the wrong thing, like, what good is that? So prison is long-term incarceration after you've been tried and convicted or adjudicated because, you know, this isn't law and order. More than 90% of cases in this country are just pled out because the prosecutor is the most powerful person in the criminal legal system, and they can literally create crime. I ask all my interns when they start, if I break into your house, well, I don't even say that. If I go into your house and I take a TV, what crime did I commit? Like theft. I'm like, well, throw on larceny. How much is the TV worth? Larceny over X amount of dollars, right? Are you in the house? Did I break in? Breaking and entering, occupy building. If I'm a prosecutor, my job's easy as hell. Okay, I can now throw 8 charges at you, and I can threaten to stack them, and now you're facing 40 years for taking a $300 TV, right? So of course you're gonna plea out to this 8-year bid, right? That makes their job easier. There's a radical strategy that like Lawyering for Black Lives and some other folks have talked about that if every defense attorney in this country, and it's risky, I wouldn't advise, I can't morally advise it at this point in time, because I think, honestly, one of the failings of the modern abolitionist movement is prioritizing ideology over people. And what I'm saying is that the radical strategy is, if every defense attorney in this country says, I'm not going to plea bargain with prosecutors, it's like the fill a jail strategy of the civil rights movement, right? Like, they just can't, they don't have the resources for all of us, right? If we say we're not going to expedite your criminal legal system and we're going to flood the courts with people, right? And of course, the problem is, like, I met a white dude from Garden City, who, sorry, I should have actually finished that, but I got ahead of myself. So he got a 37-year-and-a-half minimum sentence for robbing a Hungry Howie's with a toy gun while he was high on crack, because he refused to plea deal. That's a white man, right? Like, are you kidding me? 37 years he got $120. So, because he didn't take that 10-year plea, right? So that's what I'm saying. I can't morally tell someone, if I'm not going to do that time, like, hey, you should not take this plea deal and possibly take this 37-year bid, right? So that's the tough thing. But if every defense attorney in this country somehow could be on the same page, so we're not going to do it, then that mass mobilization would happen, right? If you want to see like this broader issue that I'm talking about, Killer Mike in 2015, he spoke at a Pan-Africanist conference in Atlanta, and it was following the Baltimore uprising, and he kind of went off on people. He was like, don't send these young black kids out here dying in the streets telling them they need to rebel and fight against the police because you're mad that you were not born in the 60s or 70s, right? A lot of times I think we say, oh yeah, you should do this. Like, yeah, right. Like, Attica was great, right? Like, no, tons of people lost their lives in Attica, right? And that's what I'm saying. Like, if you don't have skin in the game, if I'm not in prison, I'm not going to tell this person in prison to riot or rebel because I'm going to go home tonight, you know? And that's just not cool on my part. So sorry. That was my ADHD. But yes, so jail, short term in this state, you don't go to prison if you have less than a year sentence. You're going to do that time in county jail, right? So the marijuana example, you may find a lot of people in local county jails, particularly some random counties like Emmett County, Michigan. You might find someone who has a little bit of marijuana in a county jail. But in terms of being sentenced to prison, that's not really happening. And of course, most people in jail are pre-trial because they're just too poor, right? It's the issue around bail reform. So prison, long term, you've already been convicted, you're sentenced to the state prison. Every county has their own jail. State prisons are wherever in the state. And of course, there's also the federal system, but we can talk about that. And that's a sliver of the amount of people in the country because your average dope boy ain't getting picked up by the FBI. And then probation, of course, is front end, essentially trying to keep people out of prison, parole, back end, getting people out of prison early. So yeah, stop saying those, it's annoying. And you see it every day in news and everything. But yeah, and stop calling the police. The little anecdote I said was at the Abdul thing, after the event cleared out and everything, it was in my backyard. There was a sign on my front door I forgot to take away that said, Abdul event in the backyard, go around back. It's like 11 o'clock at night. Now I'm at the crib by myself. And I get a knock at like my back kitchen window. Like, what the hell is this? And then I like go look and I'm like, wait, who's this random? Like, why is he walk? Oh man, that's a crackhead. And it's like, there was a crackhead in my backyard knocking on my back window talking about, is Abdul home? And it's like, bro, this is a campaign event. Like, and that was hours ago. Abdul does not live here. But I had a conversation the next day with my mom. She was like, you called the police? He was trespassing. I was like, hell no, I'm not calling the police. Like, I just walked outside and I was like, hey bro, get the F out of my backyard. And he's like, oh, he scurries away. And, you know, of course, I'm 6'1", over 200 pounds. So, you know, exactly. So I understand why it may be hard for someone, right? If my sister, who's a lot smaller than me, you know, was at home alone, right? She may be intimidated by a man wandering around her backyard at 11 p.m., right? So I understand it's easier said than done in certain situations. But in little minor things, and I like the example that PG was talking about, like when your car is broken into, right? Like a lot of times the car insurance companies aren't going to pay for that damage unless you have the police report, right? And like I said, power concedes nothing without demand, so we should go to these insurance companies and say, hey, which one of y'all are going to say, hey, if my car is broken into, you don't need that police report, right? And we should all then start a campaign to support those car insurance companies that do that, right? Let's see. So yeah, I don't want to be respectful of everyone else's time. Stop calling. Proximity is really important as well. Like I said, every county, except if it's like a very, very small county, they may share a jail with a neighboring county. You're close to someone who's incarcerated, whether you know it or not, physically or familial or whatever it may be. Once again, I have to hark back to Alabama, but like, there's some places where there's nothing going on in prisons. People sit around all day doing nothing, and idle time really is the devil's workshop. I'm not religious, but I like that phrase. But just volunteering in your local jail means a lot for people, right? Whatever skill you have, if you can draw well, go and draw with some incarcerated people. It helps out. You know, the people who are in your lives and who are incarcerated, like hold them accountable when they, you know, do or say stupid stuff, and talk to them and be there to support them. Getting as proximate to these issues is really important. In the 5 years I've been doing this work, the most important experiences I've had have been sitting in a prison talking to somebody. And I would encourage everyone to try to get as close and as proximate as possible. And when you do that is when this possibility for narrative change work happens. And like Mike was saying, you know, and PG was saying, calling out, you know, irresponsible things that are being said from your family members, things like that. I've had an interesting dynamic being in Michigan where it's like, man, I really don't like DOC people, but sometimes people I've met across in the MDOC, I'm like, damn, why are you like kind of a nice person? Like, it would be a lot easier if I could just hate you, right? But we had a meeting last year with the chair of the parole board, Mike Egan, who's a former prosecutor. And it was kind of fascinating hearing him say, we don't want to max anyone out of prison. The problem is the public wants to. Right? And maxing out means like if I have a 10 to 20 year bid, right, I'm parole eligible after 10 years, but you hold me all 20 years and I come home not on parole. And that was just wild. And it's like, this is a former prosecutor, an old white dude, saying, I want to let these people out of prison early. But the problem is when I do it, they go to the local prosecutor, they make a fuss, and then they appeal it or whatever, and they don't want it, right? Like, and that's about narrative change, and that's about our attitudes about people coming home, even people who've killed people, even people who've raped people, because at the end of the day, I think about more so like, prison doesn't help. It's called Department of Corrections, but it really don't correct shit. Just makes things worse. And you can keep someone in prison past all the, everything we know psychologically, like 20, 25 years or so, before you actually start incurring more damage on the incarcerated person. So you can just keep on holding them and treating them like an animal, but 90+% of people are coming home. And what type of neighbor do you want, right? So that's it. I apologize for taking too much time.
No, that's fine. Okay, what I'd like to say is the most discouraging thing for someone who is a formerly incarcerated person is that the carceral state, it doesn't stop after you get home. You have that felony on your record, and sometimes you're obstructed from getting housing. You can't get, certain entitlements that other members of the population can get. It restricts you from certain jobs, that you can do. And let me just tell you something that was just insane. Okay, so I'm also a performer, and I was singing with this band, and I've had a foster care license. I've had an adoption license. I had a social work license. And so I'm singing with this band, and we were going to sing in the casino, but I couldn't get a gaming license because I had to perform. But now what the hell was I going to do on the floor of the casino that was more important than what I could have did to a child? Just some stuff is just stupid, and that just really ticked me off. So I quit the band. But anyway, yeah. But it's that people still feel like you're incarcerated. So having these conversations, Amanda, and Ashley, these kinds of, and I see a former professor out there sitting right there. I think I see you. Yes. He's had me come to be a speaker in his class a couple times. I don't even remember what I talked about because I talk a lot once I get going. But, and then I see another person here that it was from MPRI. You still doing that? It's called Region Offender Success Dan, whatever now. They always coming up with names. You quit the protest and you quit in protest, and the protest is against the lovely people at the Michigan Department of Corrections, who thought. See, I was on Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative when it first started. Well, kind of, sort of, after Dennis Schranz got the whole thing going. And that's when they decided that they were going to, they, meaning the Department of Corrections, they're going to be they a lot right now. But we know we talk about that. When I switch to they, I'll let you know. And so they decided they were going to give money to the community organizations. So they gave the money to the Catholic Charities of Michigan, around Michigan. And Catholic Social Services, which is a grassroots kind of community organization, was dispensing the money for certain services that were available to people coming back in our area, who, were formerly incarcerated. And so then they had substance use disorder services. They contracted with local substance use, disorder agencies. They did all that stuff. Well, then after, it almost felt like a pilot project, because after a certain amount of years, the MDOC looked at that and decided that they could better manage the funds. Really? Really? So you're going to better manage what happens to people on the outside while they on the inside, because you're going to start right. Okay, so they took the money back, and now the recidivism rate had been like 75-some%, right, or more. And then when Catholic Charities got the money, it went down to like, what, 20%, something like that. So now the MDOC decided they want to do it. So they took the money back, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's a hot mess. So Excuse my non-technical terminology, but once I get fired up, I say what I'm feeling. Okay, and so now, what can people do? People can be aware of what's going on with this whole with the Department of Corrections and funding for people that are returning home. So don't just focus on not getting people there and people who are there getting them out. But when they get out, what kind of services and what kind of community support can you provide? What kind of conversations are you having with community members? Are you aware of organizations in the community who are working with individuals and on this reform? Like ACLU is saying, they have these committees or workshops or whatever we want to call them, projects coming up that you can become a part of. Get involved, be a voice in support of people who are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, or on their way to be incarcerated because they don't have the services that they need. Become advocates like PG here. Work with that. I'm really interested in that. I'm just too old to be in some of that stuff. But girl, I just want to go in there and fight and say stuff, after listening to you. And I'm going to tell you, I would fight for you, girl. I'm going to just tell you that right now. And, and get involved and be a voice and stand up, and support people, who are going through this, because that's what they're your mothers, they're your sisters, they're your friends, they're your cousins, they a friend of a friend. In some kind of way, you've been affected by this carceral state that's going on. And, it just ain't right, because folks are going to come back home. And just like, what's your name? Korbin. Just like Korbin was saying, we ain't gonna do the light skin, dark skin thing.
Hey, we gotta talk about it. It's real.
It ain't real here today. It ain't real here today. We all black. And if you don't believe it, do your ancestry DNA. Oh, okay, all right. Because I found out all kinds of African I am. But anyway, so I went to Africa. But anyway, so what I'm saying is, just like Korbin was saying, which now I forgot because he said that, but whatever he said. I'm sorry, Amanda. I know. And but become involved, with the movement, because what makes me most hopeful is that a group of people like you would come together, and especially the young people, and be interested in this topic enough to be sitting here and wanting to do something. Because every movement, because I was around when they had the civil rights movement and the marching and stuff and all that. And it was always the young people, the students, the sit-ins and everything. It was always that group that led every movement. So, and PG, it was that group. You in that group this time, for such a time as this, you're in that group, so. Anyway, this has been really great. All right, Amanda, now that I have vented.
So I just want to do a time check. We have about 10 minutes left, and we want to be sure to get questions from folks. We won't be able to answer them all, but at least getting some of them in the room. But so Antonio and PG, quickly, concrete next steps.
Got you. Quickly. 1, who are your people? What is your self-interest? Find it. You all have it. It's just because you haven't been incarcerated before, you have some type of self-interest. Figure out what your self-interest is and do the work with that type of motivation. I think that's what moves us all forward. But get your people, though. Like, white people here shouldn't leave without thinking that it's your duty and responsibility to talk to other white people. I don't want to talk to white people. I pride myself on very minimal interactions with white folks that I don't know and trust. And so it is your responsibility to do that, not mine. There are a lot of good organizations you could donate to if you have the resources for that. BYP 100, we're always raising money to make sure that young black folks get skilled up in these types of skills about de-escalation and what it means to be an abolitionist and how we can do that in practice. You could also donate to the Bail Project. Locally, we're doing a national bailout day for Black Mama's Day. And nationally, that's work that's happening. And we know that getting folks out of jail and paying their bail is one very small step, but it's a good step, and you can contribute to that. And then the other thing is, what is it that you need to learn more about? What is it that you need to be in study with? What is it that you need to be learning and skilling up on? Because when the day comes that all of this shit gets burned to the ground, we need to know that there are folks in our communities that have tangible skills that will help keep us safe. So go to a de-escalation training. If you have those skills, host a training. There's all types of things. We can talk about it. I'm down to think about where those trainings exist for you. I'm down to talk about where you need to give your money to. Come up and talk to me.
Gorgeous. Thank you. Antonio.
Real quick, some next steps, concrete. I think that you should support this project here, and you should invest in this project here that these professors and Amanda and the rest of the panelists have their concrete foundations in. I think that you should hold our new governor and new attorney general and lieutenant governor accountable to changing the old Snyder and old attorney general policies that they follow. It's a new Democratic leadership, and so they should be able to have fresh new ideas and vision out from this project here. I think that we can present fresh new ideas and vision collectively, bringing resources together to fund such a project such as this can continue to expand what that would look like as far as dismantling the punishment system and creating communities where they are safe. And also, I think that, again, more younger people need to be involved in leading the conversations. You do not understand how valuable our young people are in terms of how their future should look. And so as an adults, we want to parent things, but we also want to raise our children, but we have to allow our children to be able to show us that they are young adult people as well. And their voices need to be heard. It matters, and who they are, it counts. So invest in this project, please.
Thank you. So now, how does it work? Is there a microphone going around? Or?
Steal one of these.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm thinking, why don't we try and get several questions in the room? I think there's nothing more powerful than posing questions. So let's go ahead and get like 4 or 5. We probably won't be able to answer many of them, but go ahead and pose them.
I have a question that relates to how I like to think of incarceration. We know what to do with all these other resources we have at our disposal to help further this mission.
Thank you. So don't answer that. We're going to just get some more questions in the room. Yeah.
I have a more specific question. Mine is, I'm sure most of us in this room have seen the Netflix documentary, The 13th. The system profits off of prisoners, and my question is, can and how can we remove the profit incentive from the system that is profiting from people who are incarcerated?
Great, thank you.
So my question is specifically actually for PG. I'm a high school teacher, and I was curious just to push into the idea of how do I create sort of these things for my students. For, you spoke about language, which I think is really important. So also not pushing my views, not pushing the things that I necessarily believe in, but creating opportunities for my students to both take a leadership role, but also to listen to each other coming from the different perspectives that they have.
Just a quick follow-up, where do you teach?
In San Rafael, California.
I don't know what that means.
Let's get 2 or 3 more questions. Yeah.
I'm part of Friends of Restorative Justice, and we're interested in finding, making prosecution in Washtenaw County more progressive. And I'm wondering how we can find progressive prosecutors, or people who want to be progressive prosecutors.
Do you think there is ever a situation in which life without parole is a just sentence?
Any last burning questions that folks want to get out? These have been great.
Final burning questions. One in the back.
Sorry if the question isn't clear enough, but where do you think the intersection of like police abolition is with prison abolition? I think those two things are like very tied together, but I think we talk about them separately a lot. So just kind of like imagining how do we do both of those things at once?
Okay, obviously we could spend all week talking about any one of these questions, but I think it's at least really good to know kind of like where folks' minds are and the questions that people want to be talking about, and so link up with each other afterwards. But some things that are on the table for anyone who wants to take them in this last 4 minutes: the relationship between organizations in this movement, how can we remove the profit incentive of the carceral state, what kind of work can we be building with high school students, how do we find the people's prosecutor candidates, is there ever a situation in which life without parole is justified, and police and prison abolition, what's the relationship?
I just want to speak to the one thing about finding progressive prosecutors. Okay, I'm a resident of this county. I was born in Ann Arbor. Listen, I haven't seen anybody with one person's name on the ballot for prosecuting attorney in Washtenaw County. So, I mean, even if you wanted to vote for somebody else, you can't. So, unless you got some recommendations of some attorneys that might be progressive and want to run, we kind of stuck.
Let me just say on that, I'm not running. But there will be people running in 2020. I'll just say that. Yeah. Not me.
I just want to say in response to the question that you asked, it's so much that we look to the United States Supreme Court of America's, the justice's decision to separate juveniles from adults, giving juveniles their own class, separate from adults, and the reason behind that, the evidence that was presented to the justices to make such a decision to evolve the Eighth Amendment on cruel and unusual punishment. And so when we look at crime, we have to understand why is it necessary within our society, right? And if we understand why is it necessary, who is behind the intention of creating that or breeding the elements for crime to be a condition in society, right? So if a society, if a community existed at one time absent of criminal activity or the actions of one acting in the capacity of a criminal, right, then it could come to exist again like that. So who or what was behind breeding and implementing such that would enter into a community for such to happen, and who was responsible for the collapse of such a community by taking away resources from such a community so it wouldn't have an economical flow for it to exist and be successful. You understand what I'm saying? And so I would say, instead of looking at is it necessary, let's look at why is it necessary for someone to think that such criminal acts should exist in the first place or create such conditions for the acts to take place. That makes sense? Okay.
If I could just say briefly the first two questions, there is a lot of communication going on. ACLU and Detroit Justice Center is working very closely. Detroit Justice Center gives me a lot of hope, too. We work with the American Friends Service Committee on legislation. We work in coalition. There's lots of coalitions to end mass incarceration. We work with a lot of folks, formerly incarcerated folks. So it can always be better, yeah, but it's happening, don't you think? A little bit, yeah. And the profit motive in the prison system is there. Lots of people's jobs are dependent on, perpetuating the prison industrial complex. In Michigan, you know why all those prisons are up north, away from people's families? Because, those communities depend on it for their livelihood, and it's not right. It's not right. They have a lot of political power. And the bail bondsmen, the private bail companies, they're all making money off of money bill, and they're extorting people. It's awful. We have to name it and point it out and find other jobs for people up north, and that it's important to recognize the role that money plays in mass incarceration.
Final word, Korbin, and then PG.
Yeah. I'm not responsible enough to have the final word. But on the point of money, just following up, Mike, that housing human beings costs money, and warehousing human beings costs money. So someone's going to make money, whether the building is public or private, of course. And you all should look up what happened when they tried to close Ojibwe prison at the end of 2018. And that community is going to constantly be on the wrong side of history for their fight to try to save their prison because they need the jobs. I understand why they need the jobs, but that's actually a conversation that community needs to have about how the global economy has changed since the 1960s when the logging industry went away in Marinesco County, right? And someone from Marinesco County, maybe someone who left, needs to go back there and say, hey, we actually need to talk about automation. We need to talk about how the global economy has changed. We need to talk about outsourcing of jobs. It's not this quick fix of, hey, poor white people, you got a prison. They'll hold black folks from Detroit, Pontiac, Flint in them. So y'all are good. You got your little middle-class job. Call it a day. And ultimately, I don't think that you can ever remove the profit out of prisons without and closing prisons, right? At the end of the day, you have to close prisons. And I'm really glad that Michigan has, but then even after you close them, the next step is you have to destroy them or you have to take them out of the state's hands. The city of Muskegon at the end of March purchased the former West Shoreline facility that closed in 2017. No, they closed March of 2018, sorry. But they purchased it for $2.5 million. The last thing I'll say, because we're at University of Michigan, is lots of people don't know Jim Harbaugh actually has a title that's not Michigan head football coach. It's like the Ira something Davis head football family coach. That family bought that position for $10 million. The city of Muskegon bought a former prison for $2.5 million. If you know rich ass people, tell them, hey, go buy a prison. Close it, turn it into a park. Do whatever the hell you want to do with it. But you have to actually close the prisons. And you can buy prisons. Like a radical idea that rich people can do is, let me just pull up to a state and say, hey state, here's $10 million, give me your prison. It happens. Oh, the marathon continues.
Okay. So quickly, I will say, I totally agree with what Korbin just said, that there's no way to remove the profit incentive without dismantling capitalism and ending the prison industrial complex, period. The thing around like cross-organizational relationships, cross-generational relationships is something I'm like really learning about and struggling with right now in my work. Amanda and I both are on the board of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center in Detroit, and that's amazing. It's like an amazing opportunity to work with a lot of folks who have been doing organizing in the city for decades. And what it highlights more than ever is the way that all this work operates in silos, right? Like I've lived in the city, I've gone to school in the city, and there's some stuff that was happening while I was in high school that happened right down the street from my high school that I had no idea about, right? Like there's just things that happen all the time that we don't know because we're doing work in our own communities or we're doing them on our own issues, and there's not a lot of opportunity or space made to cross that. I also think that sometimes harm is done and there's trust that's lost between organizations because of different ideologies, because of different practices. I know that as a young organizer here, one of the reasons why we started BYP 100 as this Black queer organization is because in a lot of the young Black organizing spaces we were in, it was explicitly transphobic. It was explicitly homophobic. It was like there was absolutely no way. How am I supposed to put my body on the line and do direct action and civil disobedience with people who don't believe that I am who I say I am, right? And like, how do I do that? It felt impossible. We said, fuck that, we're gonna start our own thing. And that type of separation happens so easily and happens all the time for a lot of different reasons. And it's hard to mend it if we don't have the models and the space made to like actually do that type of accountability work and build with each other. And so a lot of what I've been feeling recently is like regret that we walked away from that organizing space because they are like this particular group is able to mobilize a lot of Black folks like around issues really, really quickly, but we just don't agree, right? And it's just like, how can I work with somebody who I fundamentally disagree with, even if we both have good intentions, right? And like we both want the collective liberation for all oppressed people, right? Like it's just hard. It's really, really hard. And I think there's work we have to do to work past that. There was a Facebook status recently about Detroit activism communities and how fractured it is. And, you know, there's this thing about funding, who gets to say that they claim this victory, who gets to, right? Like all of that too, which is capitalism. It's stuff that's pitting us against each other. And so there's a lot of ways we could have a session just on that, honestly, like for real. It's deep. It runs deep. It runs across generation. The thing about young people picking up the mantle is that old people have to let it go. And sometimes old people aren't willing to let it go. They die eventually, but some people stay in positions for like 40 years. You know what I mean? It's just like, how? How am I supposed to feel like I can have leadership if you've been in this role since before I was born? You know, like that's wild. But that's what has to happen. Old people have to say, all right, cool, I trust you, do it, right? Here's some resources. Here's what I learned, do it. And instead, they're like, no, let me do it. Tell me, but let me do it. Like, tell me what to do, but let me do it, right? And that's hard to work past. It's so hard. So there's some conversations intergenerationally we need to be having across communities. And then the last thing I'll say is about the teaching young folks. I'm all about that. A lot of my professional work prior to the last like 3 years was in schools. And I'm always happy to talk about the curriculums that are available to do this type of work, and also how we can use our classrooms in non-traditional ways. And I think that, you know, the school is another industrial complex that teaches us that we have to do things a certain way. We have to treat students a certain way. We have to assume that they know things, assume that they don't know some things. Like, what would happen if you let them teach a class for a week, right? Like, what could they possibly teach you, or what could they teach each other? And other ways that we can open our classrooms up in non-traditional ways to let their knowledge out, see where they're at, and then be able to say, okay, great, you're already thinking about this, here's some more resources, right? Or you're already thinking about this, here's how you can actually get involved in that in your community right now. And depending on the types of students you're teaching, if they're majority white, or if you're in like a community that's mostly a community of color, then that also has different dynamics, right? Because there's some explicit work that young white people need to be doing to unlearn a lot of stuff that their parents and grandparents are teaching them. And then there's stuff that also communities of color have to be unlearning and learning, maybe not at the hands of a white man, but at the hands of other people who you open your classroom to, right? For guest speaking or things like that. So always down to rap about that. I get really excited about it. The intersection of police and prison abolition. I'm trying to get as many as I took notes so I can. Okay, last one. The intersection is that they are completely intersected. When we talk about the prison industrial complex, we're talking about police, we're talking about criminalization, we're talking about surveillance, we're talking about the actual buildings in which all this stuff happens. And so that's courthouses and that's prisons and jails. And so I think that if you're hearing that folks are talking about them separately, then what you're hearing is that folks aren't seeing the full picture, and that there needs to be some stepping back to really get the full view of what actually is happening and how that stuff is funneling. So because I always see them as always linked, right? Like this always linked, there's always an intersection, and we can't talk about undoing one without undoing it all. So again, lots of resources on that I'm happy to point folks to.
So PG, thank you for a brilliant and beautiful last word, not just for this panel, but for this entire year's symposium. So let's hear it for everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out all year long, and stay tuned. There are going to be lots of ways to continue this work and to continue to plug in. We want to hear from you about ways that you want to see the Carceral State Project evolve in the years to come. So thank you all again for all of your questions and for your commitment to this. Thank you.